In the autumn of 1220, the largest Islamic state of that time, Khwarazm, simply fell apart. The country was engulfed in fire and panic. The great cities of the Silk Road, Otrar, Bukhara, Samarkand, fell one after another under the onslaught of the Mongols. And Khwarazm Shah Muhammad himself, who just yesterday felt like the king of the world, hid on some god-forsaken island in the Caspian Sea and was dying from stress and fever. However, in the northeast, on the banks of the Sirdarya, there was one man who decided that the general trend of capitulation was not for him. He had only 1,000 fighters against a 20,000-strong avalanche of Mongols, and his name was Timur Malik. And now you'll understand why he's worth knowing about. Hello everyone, you're on the Amazing History channel. And today we're going to analyze probably the boldest military episode of the Mongol invasion era. We know this story from a Persian chronicler who actually supported the Mongols and worked for them. But even he, when describing the actions of Timur Malik, couldn't help but express fan-like excitement and wrote everything as if it were a blockbuster script. But first, our traditional thanks to our sponsors and regular viewers. It is your support that helps us create this kind of content. Well, now let's get started. To be continued. The Khwarazmian Shah state was a real superpower of its time. By 1215, Khwarazm was absolutely on the rise. The ruler Muhammad II expanded so much in 15 years that his territory stretched from India to the Kazakh steppes. He controlled the entire Silk Road, was raking in gold, and seriously called himself the second Alexander the Great. But, as they say, there was a catch. Inside this giant machine, everything was held together with spit and a prayer. The army was just a bunch of hired gangs who only listened to their own field commanders. Regional elites took everything for themselves. And even Shah's mother, Tarkan Khatun, was playing her own game and handing out positions left and right without asking her son. In short, it was a very fragile alliance that only worked until the first serious upheaval, and that upheaval came. In 1218, Muhammad encountered the Mongols in the field for the first time. 3 days of fighting, 20,000 corpses on his side, and the Mongols just went about their business. But the Shah got a harsh dose of reality. He saw how Genghis Khan's men fought, and to be honest, he got discouraged. And then a legendary act of stupidity happened, the Otrar massacre. The local big shot, Inalchuk, robs a Mongol caravan and kills the merchants. Genghis Khan sends envoys saying, "Hand over this thug to us." But Muhammad, instead of apologizing, executes the envoys. At that time, it was the same as walking up to a sleeping bear and hitting it on the head with a log. According to the steppe code, killing an envoy is an invitation to war. When the Mongols crossed the border in 1219, Muhammad made the worst decision in history. Instead of gathering all his enormous forces into a single force and fight a decisive battle, he got scared. The Shah did not trust his generals. He was afraid that if he gathered them all together in one place, they would either overthrow him or scatter after the first failure. As a result, he simply scattered the army across separate fortresses, and that was a death sentence. The Mongols just started methodically taking out the cities one by one. Otrar, Tashkent, Bukhara, Samarkand, they all fell one by one. This second Alexander was setting records for running away at that time. He ended his days on a barren island in the middle of the Caspian Sea in December 1220. They say that the man who owned half the world didn't even have a piece of cloth for a shroud. It is in such chaos that the story of Timur Malik begins. And he was probably the only one who, in this hopeless situation, acted with cold calculation and nerves of steel. Now, let's talk about who Timur Malik is. There is no biography of him in the style of was born, studied, got married. We don't have any portraits of him, and we don't know his exact age. As for his origins, Timur Malik was a true son of this region. He was a prominent representative of that very military and political elite in which Turkic passion and a steely character were mixed with the deepest Persian culture and traditions. Khujand was his home, and for this region he is an unquestionable superhero, regardless of what language he gave his orders in. In short, Timur Malik is the perfect combination of qualities on which the entire defense of the region relied at that time. His official status was Emir of Khujand, which is like a mayor of the city, but with very broad military powers. Before the war, he was an ordinary official in uniform, but when the Black Swan in the form of the Mongols arrived, he suddenly put on such a performance that everyone started talking about him. And here we come to the person who, in fact, made Timur Malik famous for centuries. Meet Ala Adin Ata Malik ibn Muhammad Juvayni, or simply Juvayni. Juvayni, although he was of Persian origin, served the Mongols, hung out in their capital Karakorum, and at the same time wrote the history of their conquests. And he wrote it like a real horror story, calling the Mongols the wrath of God. And this Juvayni, who in theory was supposed to praise only Chinggis Khan, suddenly dedicates an entire chapter to Timur Malik. And he writes it in such a style as if it's not a chronicle but a script for Marvel. He quotes the Quran, sprinkles in verses from the Shahnameh, and gives Timur Malik the highest compliment one could think of at that time. He compared him to Rustam. And just so you understand, Rustam in Persian culture is like Hercules, Achilles, and Superman all rolled into one. So why did Juvayni go so overboard with the praise? Well, first of all, he was an aesthete, and he was genuinely fascinated by how beautifully and boldly this guy fought. And secondly, his audience was Muslims who, after a total defeat by the Mongols, needed at least some reason to feel proud. Like, yes, we lost, but look what a beast we had. Of course, Juvayni might have embellished some things and added some epicness for effect, but the core, the siege itself, and how Timur Malik managed to get out of hopeless situations is confirmed by other sources, and what he eventually came up with turned an ordinary siege into a unique special operation, the likes of which simply didn't exist in Central Asia. Khujand, today it's the second largest city in Tajikistan, and it's not just a beautiful spot on the map. In 1220, it was also a strategic hub on the Sir Darya. The city guarded the western entrance to the rich Fergana Valley. The Mongols, who were better at strategy than many others, sent a separate corps there. There is some confusion in the sources. It was either Genghis Khan's son or his top generals, but the names aren't important. The point is that the Mongols approached Khujand already fired up. They had just taken the neighboring Binakent, where they killed some of the residents and drove the rest into Kashar. Kashar is an extremely brutal tactic where prisoners from among the locals are forced to carry stones, build siege towers, and go in the first line of attack under the arrows of their own people. It turned into a wild situation. The Khwarazmians were destroying their own fortresses with their own hands under the supervision of Mongol overseers. Timur Malik saw all of this. He understood that if he simply locked himself in the city citadel, it would be a slow suicide. The Mongols had top engineers from China who could crack stone walls like nuts. To sit in the fortress meant just waiting for a huge boulder to come crashing down on your head. And then Timur Malik makes an unconventional decision. In the middle of the Sir Darya, there was an island, a small piece of land with a fortress, surrounded by water on all sides. Timur Malik realized that water was like kryptonite for the Mongols. Cavalry was useless in such a siege. Archers too, since the river was too wide, the arrows simply couldn't reach, and it was impossible to bring siege engines close to the walls. It was a brilliant calculation. He took the fight to terrain where the Mongols' numerical superiority didn't matter, and the townspeople stayed in the citadel. And Timur Malik, with 1,000 elite warriors, moved to the island, but he wasn't planning to just sit there and wait. Before the bridges were burned, he gave the order to build 12 barges. If Juvayni hadn't described their construction in such detail, you might think it's fantasy. But no, this was a real 13th century engineering hack. The hulls of the barges were coated with a mixture of clay and vinegar and then covered with layers of wet felt on top. The main weapon of the Mongols, burning oil, literally flowed down this coating without causing any harm. The ships were practically invulnerable to fire. Narrow firing slits were cut into the sides. It was almost impossible to hit an archer through such a slit from the shore, but Timur Malik's men were shooting at the Mongols as if at a shooting range. In fact, Timur Malik invented river ironclads hundreds of years before it became mainstream. Timur Malik was up against a Mongol army of 20,000 professionals and about 50,000 conscripted laborers. With such resources, the Mongols were used to solving problems quickly. They took the city citadel with ease, but when they ran into the island, their system failed. Their usual tactics just didn't work. Then the Mongol command lost their temper and decided to block the Sir Darya. The prisoners were driven into the mountains, forced to carry huge boulders and throw them into the river to build a dam straight to the island. All day, the Mongols and prisoners worked hard building the dam, but when night fell, the show began. 6 barges on one shore, 6 on the other. A sudden raid, the guards wiped out, everything built during the day destroyed, and an effective escape into the fog before dawn. The Mongols, who were used to taking down huge metropolises in just a few days, got stuck at a small island for months. For an invincible war machine, this was just utterly humiliating. But the math was brutal. The Mongols had the resources of the entire region behind them, while Timur Malik only had the food he managed to bring to the island. When the warehouses began to empty, Timur Malik realized it was time to move on to the final part of the plan. 70 ships, that's how many the craftsmen of Khujand managed to gather and build during the siege. All the remaining weapons, supplies, and the remaining warriors were loaded onto this improvised flotilla. Timur Malik stood on the lead barge, gathering around him the best archers who never missed their mark. They set out at night, and this was the moment of peak tension. Seeing the retreat, the Mongol cavalry units immediately sprang into action and chased downstream, pinning the fleet in a vice from both banks. They showered the ships with thousands of arrows and hurled pots of burning oil. In response, Timur Malik's snipers fired back at them from narrow loopholes. Juvayni describes it so poetically, as if fate itself were loosing every arrow and every shot found a gap in the armor of the Mongol horsemen. The first serious checkpoint awaited the retreating forces in the Binakent area. The Mongols stretched a heavy iron chain across the river to block the fleet's movement and shoot them point blank, but their plan failed. The Mongols sped up their ships and at full speed struck the barrier with the full weight of their fleet. The chain could not withstand it and snapped, clearing the way. However, further down the river near Khujand, the situation became even worse. The Mongols took into account the mistake with the chain and set up a more inventive ambush. They lined up a chain of boats across the Sir Darya, turning them into floating firing points equipped with ballistae. Timur Malik was informed about this trap, and he realized that the river route was no longer viable. The fleet landed on the shore before reaching Khujand. At that moment, the unique river stage ended and a brutal fight for survival on the steppe began. Landing on land meant that the advantage returned to the Mongols. Their cavalry once again had room to maneuver. Timur Malik sent the main convoy ahead, while he and a handful of loyal fighters stayed behind to take the brunt of the attack and give the others a chance to escape. The bloodiest part of this story began, where every meter of land cost dozens and dozens of lives. What began in the steppe after disembarking from the ships, Juvayni describes as a slow, agonizing decline. It was a series of endless, exhausting skirmishes. The Mongols attacked in waves. As soon as one group was exhausted, a fresh one would arrive to take its place. Timur Malik's warriors fell one after another. Eventually, the moment came when there was no one left around him. Timur Malik had only 3 arrows left in his quiver. One of them didn't even have a tip. The ending of this story is worthy of a Hollywood adaptation. 3 Mongols are also pursuing Timur Malik, and he realizes that escaping the pursuit is impossible. Instead, he suddenly turns around and goes on a counterattack. First, he shoots that very broken arrow. The bare splinter of wood flies straight to the target and knocks out the eye of one of the pursuers. And it doesn't matter whether it was extraordinary skill or just incredible luck. One Mongol was out, and the other 2 pursuers decided not to tempt fate and headed home. Of course, you can argue as much as you want about how much Juvayni embellished this story, but the fact remains. Timur Malik actually made it out of that bloodbath alive. Gurganj, early 1221. This is not a sight for the faint-hearted. The once great capital of the Khwarazm Shahs looked like scenes from a zombie apocalypse. The old Shah Muhammad was spending his last days somewhere, while in the capital itself the elites were fighting over the throne, as the Mongols were already on the doorstep. It was into this snake pit that Timur Malik arrived after his incredible steppe marathon. And almost at the same time, Jalal ad-Din, the Shah's eldest son, arrived there. Jalal ad-Din was the complete opposite of his father. If Muhammad was always, so to speak, hesitating and hiding, then his son was a bold guy who was looking for a fight. In Gurganj, Jalal ad-Din was betrayed by his own people. The local officials didn't want a strong leader and started plotting conspiracies. The new Shah realized it was safer to leave, as his own people were more likely to betray him than the Mongols. Only 300 horsemen left with him, and Timur Malik was among them. It was a perfect duo. One needed a legitimate leader, the other needed a pro who wouldn't betray him and knew how to humiliate the Mongols on the battlefield. The very first serious clash showed that the guys meant business. A detachment of 700 Mongols was almost completely wiped out. The chronicles wrote with great pathos. For the first time, the Muslim sword tasted Mongol blood, and this gave a powerful boost to all the survivors. It turns out that the invincible can and should be defeated. People started to flock to Jalal ad-Din, and soon he had a decent army. In 1221, the legendary Battle of Parwan took place. This was the Mongols' greatest failure of the campaign. The location was chosen perfectly, a narrow, rocky gorge. The Mongol cavalry couldn't gain speed there, nor could they outflank them. Timur Malik took the high ground with his archers in this battle and unleashed a hellish barrage of fire on the Mongols. They tried to use a psychological attack. They put dummies on horses to make it seem like there were more of them. But Jalal ad-Din didn't fall for the trick. He went straight at them and simply wiped out the Mongol corps. The blow to the Mongols' reputation was so strong that Genghis Khan personally led the army to settle this matter once and for all. The final battle took place on the Indus River. Jalal ad-Din fought like a lion, but the forces were too unequal, 30,000 against 80,000. When the ring closed in, the Shah made his famous leap, on horseback, in full armor, right into the turbulent waters of the Indus. He swam across the river under the gaze of the Mongols. Legend has it that Chinggis Khan forbade them to shoot at him, telling his sons, "This is who you should strive to be like." Where was Timur Malik at that moment? The sources lose track of him in the dust of battle. It is only known that he went through the entire Indian period with Jalal ad-Din, but then their paths diverged. Jalal ad-Din spent another 10 years roaming across Asia, trying to build a new empire, until he was killed by random bandits in the mountains. But at this point, the story of Timur Malik takes an unexpected turn. After Jalal ad-Din rode off into the sunset, the trail of Timur Malik is lost. Juvayni gives us a completely unexpected detail. Our tough warrior, engineer, and sniper is suddenly found in Damascus as a Sufi, that is, a man who has given up war and gone into deep spiritual self-discovery. Whether this was real Zen or just the perfect cover for a man being hunted by all Mongol intelligence, we will never know, but after years he decided to return home. By this time, the world had changed beyond recognition. The Mongols had cemented their order, and the irony of fate was that Timur Malik's son was already working for the new authorities. He governed his father's lands under a Mongol mandate. Timur Malik came to Khujand incognito. He met his son, but his son did not recognize him. When his father went to war, his son was still an infant. To prove who he was, Timur Malik had to call his old slave and show his scars. The hero who terrified Genghis Khan's army stood before his own child and proved his existence. The appearance of the strange old man aroused the interest of the Mongol guards. He was detained by the squad of the Mongol prince Kadagan. The interrogation began, and among the guards was that same one-eyed Mongol who, many years ago on the steppe, had received a greeting from Timur Malik in the form of a broken arrow. He recognized him immediately. Timur Malik behaved during the interrogation as if he was still commanding the fortress. Not a trace of fear, not a trace of respect for the invaders. Kadagan, unable to stand such insolence, simply drew his bow. Juvayni summed up this ending with one phrase: the Mongol arrow became the answer to all the arrows Timur Malik had shot in his lifetime. That's how his story ended. Timur Malik didn't win the war and didn't save the empire, but he showed that the Mongol war machine is not all-powerful. If you have grit, the right tactics, and 12 armored barges, you can make an entire empire stall for months. Well, that's all from me. If you found it interesting, hit the like button. You know what to do with the buttons below the video. See you in the next episode. Bye everyone.